Now, this worked before. Okay, here we go. Let's see. Sorry about that. I'm okay. I apologize for that. Let me go to. There we go. Is this? We're up and we have the first slide, correct?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, so as Jess said, during my time with the Confederated, Salish, and Kootenai tribes, I was so privileged to work for several years on this project called Living Landscapes. It was, as you said, it was funded by a project, funded by an award from NASA, and it included developing a climate science education package that targeted Native American students nationwide. The purpose is to strengthen climate literacy in tribal schools and colleges and develop highly skilled and motivated Native Americans in the climate-related sciences. So most important is it integrates the wisdom inherited from our elders and ancestors. Some people call this native science or traditional ways of knowing and understanding. And we combine that with the very best science and technology that was available. So while scientists have been investigating and talking about climate change for decades, the voices of tribal people have largely been left out of that discussion. And as tribal people, our closeness to the land and the community of life it supports and the knowledge that comes from living in a place for thousands of years gives us unique perspectives, insights, and approaches that can help the larger society adapt to climate change. So we were incredibly fortunate to have a panel of cultural advisors. There were 5 cultural advisors that helped us with this project. We were delighted to have Johnny R. Lee, who's a Salish elder. He was raised by his grandparents, and he continues to work tirelessly to preserve language. We had Tony Kashola, who since 1995 has been the director of the Salish Kalespe Culture Committee. He was also raised in part by his grandparents, and we were very lucky to have Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and professor of environmental and forest biology at SUNY. As you said, she's also an author as well as an educator. Vernon Finley's director of the Kootenai Culture Committee, past Tribal Council chair. He specializes in Kootenai language restoration and maintenance efforts, as well as delivering lots of presentations. He's incredibly active, and he attributes his grandparents for his cultural worldview. We also had Dr. Roz LaPierre. She's a professor of environmental studies at the University of Montana, and her background is so extraordinary, as are our other cultural advisors. But she has a degree in physics, so she combines science with religion, environmental history, and she spent decades learning from her grandmother, Annie Mad Plume Wall. She grew up on Blackfeet Reservation, and we were delighted to have this panel of experts help us. So Living Landscapes has 6 components. It has a high school learning unit. It has a college level climate science course. It has a lab. It has a remote sensing course. And we developed a social networking site so students can, across the nation, can communicate. And then one of the things that I really valued about this project was that we had an opportunity to bring Salish Kootenai College students to JPL, to the Jet Propulsion Lab, and meet with NASA scientists. So we began by looking at the climate science principles that were developed by NOAA, NSF, and American Association for the Advancement of Science. They are, first, the sun is the primary source of energy for the Earth's climate system. Second, climate is regulated by complex interactions among components of the Earth system. Third, life on Earth depends on, is shared by, and affects climate. And climate varies over space and time through both natural and man-made processes. And fifth, our understanding of the climate system is improved through observation, theoretical studies, and modeling. Sixth, human activities are impacting the climate system. And seven, climate change will have consequences for the Earth system and human lives. And then we added two more, because we added 8, the greenhouse effect, because we felt this concept is so fundamental that it deserved to be its own principle. And then 9, we can take action, because we really wanted students to feel empowered rather than a sense of hopelessness. And then we looked at those principles, these science principles, and we what we did was assign cultural values. We wanted to, we really wanted to have the cultural values associated with this, to really put it in a cultural context. These values for us as tribal people make up a unified whole, and at the center of which is a deeply held attitude of respect toward the land, water, plants, and animals, and a way of living closely and in community with one another. So our worldview is based not just on our relationship with each other, but our right relationship with the natural world. For instance, principle 3 is about how life on Earth affects the climate and how climate affects life. And the cultural value for the principle is relatedness. In this context, relatedness refers not just to human family relationships, but to the natural world as well. Among many of us as Native people, the family caring relationship extends to one's relationship with both plants and animals, also rivers, mountains, the natural world around us. So the incorporation of these cultural values is one way that Native science differs from Western science. Well, the latter strives for objectivity, and so generally does not encompass ethical obligations. Native science does. So placing the principle within the context of a cultural value, in this case, relatedness and reciprocity, the science becomes more relevant to Native students, especially when it's done in a concrete way. So the complete package, which we call Living Landscapes, is available online, not just to tribal educators, but throughout all of Indian country, and to any other teachers or students that want to use it. As I said, it's culturally based. And every episode begins within this package, begins with a video. And if we have time, I'm hoping that that we'll have a chance to look at some of these videos. So traditional tribal calendars are one way of measuring change. And in these calendars, months are often named for a particular activity that's done during that time, or for a natural event that occurred reliably every year at that time. So for thousands of years, these calendars stayed the same and tribal people could depend on them. But now the calendars have become out of sync with the natural world. For instance, the traditional calendar, in our calendar, on our reservation here in Montana, the name for May is Spetlam-Spkani, or month of the bitterroot, because that's when we traditionally harvested the root. But because the climate is changing, bitterroot's now often ready for digging in April. The name for August, Sha-Spkani, means month of huckleberry, but huckleberries are now ripe in July. It's the same for October, the month of chokecherry. Chokecherries are now ready in August, sometimes even in late July. And this is a particular problem because, you know, it's not just the calendar that's out of sync, but the plants and animals are out of sync as well. So oftentimes chokecherry was the food that grizzly bears relied on during hyperphagia until they went into hibernation. So in September and early October, they would rely on chokecherries until they began hibernation. And now there's this big gap, and we're finding that that grizzly bears are starting to look for non-native foods and are starting to get in trouble. And that's a problem. That's a problem for us. So let's take another month. This is one of my favorite months. It's the storytelling month, and it's oftentimes when elders would bring out our traditional stories, the stories of coyote and other animal people that are part of the seasonal cycle. And these stories can only be told in wintertime when there's snow on the ground. Traditionally, the elders brought them out in November, and they'd put them away in the springtime when the thunder would wake the hibernating animals or when the snow is gone. But now we have winters with no snow in the valleys, and maybe it only lasts a few days. And perhaps for the first time in our 12,000 year history, we've experienced years when there's confusion about when to share these most important stories that are the history of who we are. So the impacts of climate change have rippled through tribal communities, and they're affecting us profoundly and often in really unpredictable ways. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change found that Native Americans from Alaska to Florida are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change because our lives, our cultures, and economies are so closely linked with culture-sensitive resources. But that vulnerability is also a strength. Living close to the land with the collective knowledge that comes from living in a place for thousands of years provides tribal people with perspective, insights, and approaches that can help both tribal and non-tribal communities as we try to cope with and adapt to the climate crisis. An example of this, this collision of cultures is fire management. So when visitors and strangers first came to this landscape, you know, when they arrived to the Northern Rockies, they believed many of them came from European backgrounds where fire was associated with either religion or a built environment and was considered dangerous and destructive. And that view sharply contrasted with traditional knowledge that we have of tribal use of fire. We understood and embraced the benefits of fire, and we believed that fire was one of the most important management tools we had for shaping and maintaining our landscape. And now today, a couple hundred years later, fire managers understand that prescribed fire is one of the ways that they can protect life and property. So I'd like to show you in depth what goes into each of the principles. This slide shows a diagram of principle 5, which is about the greenhouse effect. So as I mentioned, each principle begins with a little video. And if we have time at the end, I'd love to show you one of our videos. The next slide provides, oh shoot, did I just move ahead? It provides an overview of the principle. And then there are about 5 or 10 slides that have sub-concepts of the principle and then local relevance. And then we have some information about misunderstandings, misconceptions about the principle. And then at the end, we have a knowledge check. And we also have a teacher's page. There are summaries of the principle, we discuss the importance of the principle, some challenges that teachers might encounter teaching the principle, how to use the principle in your classroom, activities for students that they can engage to better understand the principle. So what we have done is create this, each of these pages with layers and layers of information. So if you're a high school teacher, you can go to a certain depth. If you're a college professor or student, you can peel off more and more layers. So, as I said, there are 10 climate science labs, and students can obtain and analyze local climate data. They can use climate models to predict their climate future. They can assess impacts on resources around them, maybe fish and wildlife, and observe trends in stream flows, glaciers, wildfires, a lot of different areas that they can explore in the labs. And then, as I said, we developed a social networking site. So students can communicate across distances. They can write, they can post climate themed art, writing, poetry. They can, there's a forum for teachers. And it's a tool that we developed that we hope will be helpful for students and teachers across the globe. So do we have time to show a quick video, Jess?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, let me see if I can get this video up. Okay, here we go. As I said, each of these, each of the principles begins with a video. I'm not sure why it's not, why I'm not able to open this. There we go. Okay, let me see if I can then. Okay.
This place is our home, the home of the Salish, Ponderay, and Kootenai people for too many generations to count. I have grown up on this land like my Sile and his grandpa before that. My name is Alyssa Pretty on Top, and I live on the Flathead Indian Reservation. Each year we gather along the banks of the Flathead River for fall hunting camp. When we hunt deer and elk or harvest the bitter root for our feast, we are continuing our traditional way of life. It's hard to describe, but there is a softening influence of being in nature. These plants and animals are important because they have always been there for us, to nourish and to make our lives good. This year, my brother harvested his first deer. He told his story around the fire. We were all proud of him. My grandpa says we are the dreams and prayers of our ancestors, and that we have a responsibility to leave this world a better place. He thinks children today are like buffalo born behind the fence, with little awareness beyond their modern trappings. He says our ancestors knew the lines of the trails and curves of the hills as intimately as the lines and curves of their mothers' faces. We have to learn how to be in relationship with the earth again, and how our generation can protect it. We do it for our baby brothers and sisters, for our little cousins, and for everyone that we will love that hasn't been born yet. In the distance, I hear the constant coal trains rushing by, and I know there are many choices ahead of how to live on this earth. Sometimes it feels overwhelming, but I do believe we can hold on to our traditions. This dream isn't new. It's been lived from the beginning of time, and we've made it this far. Perhaps like my Yaya's beadwork, we can make a life that is strong and beautiful, one little step at a time, joining many little steps together.
All right, that was beautiful. Thank you, Germaine. So next we will go to Clint Carroll. Professor Carroll is an associate professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. A citizen of the Cherokee Nation, he works at the intersections of Indigenous studies, anthropology, and political ecology with an emphasis on Cherokee environmental governance and land-based resurgence. Currently, he is working on an integrated education and community-based research project funded by the National Science Foundation that investigates Cherokee access to wild plants in northeastern Oklahoma amid shifting climate conditions and land ownership patterns. Professor Carroll's research aims to inform advancements in community-based local ecosystem management and tribal land conservation strategies. Welcome, Professor Carroll. You can go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Hello, Jess. Give me a second here. Hawa, osio ni gata wo ukahat si kwani o hada wado a ji jalagi ale jalaka yes ge ha e ahan jestas ale hinonaneno ale nuch di gadohi ge ha no wo kalawade judo ita galieli ga jigedo anko higa kohusa. Hello everyone. I'm happy to be here sharing the screen with some amazing Indigenous thinkers and leaders. Thank you, Germaine, for that wonderful presentation and that beautiful video you just showed. Thanks to Anna and Jess for inviting me and all their work in organizing. I'm coming to you this evening from the traditional territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. Today, I want to talk a little about my work with Cherokee elders and knowledge keepers over the course of the past 16 years toward revitalizing land-based knowledge and practices. First, I'll offer some political and historical context for this work, followed by a discussion of my current work on a land education program with a group of Cherokee elders and students. And just to kind of mention the photos here on the screen, these are images of the aerial parts and then a 2 to 3 year old root of American ginseng. And these were taken years back when I was working for the Cherokee Nation Natural Resources Department, and we were working to reestablish ginseng in our lands in northeastern Oklahoma. It's a highly valued and very important medicinal plant for Cherokee healers. There we go. And so I want to start with this quote by Potawatomi scholar Kyle White, just to give some context to what I'll be talking about more pertaining to the specific work that I'm currently working on. And so he writes, the environmental impacts of settler colonialism mean that quite a few indigenous peoples in North America are no longer able to relate locally to many of the plants and animals that are significant to them. In the Anthropocene then, some indigenous peoples already inhabit what our ancestors would have likely characterized as a dystopian future. So we consider the future from what we believe is already a dystopia. And then next, I wanted to highlight a quote by Yuchi scholar Dan Wildcat, writing about climate change in terms of 4 removals. And he contextualizes this his view of climate change in this way. He says, I get angry when I think about global warming. I get angry because I know the history of involuntary removals and relocations Indigenous peoples throughout the United States and around the world have endured. So when I began hearing the reports of Indigenous displacement as a result of climate change, I got angry. I thought, here we go again, another removal of Indigenous peoples. So throughout my remarks today, I will go through these 4 removals that Wildcat describes in relation to Cherokee people, and what this means for our efforts to revitalize our ecological knowledge and practices today on our reservation lands in what some refer to as northeastern Oklahoma, but what we simply refer to as the Cherokee Nation. And so here's just a map that shows the difference geographically, but also in terms of the ecoregions between the Cherokee homelands to the east and where the Cherokee Nation and the majority of Cherokee people reside today in the northeastern part of present-day Oklahoma. And just wanted to highlight here the eastern extent that spans Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, parts of Kentucky, western North Carolina, western South Carolina, of course the core settlement area being in the southern Appalachian Mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains. And then compare and contrast that with what you see to the west, our current lands, which really straddle the central irregular plains and the westernmost extent of the Ozark Highlands and Boston Mountains. And so keep that map in your mind as we talk about, again, the impacts of forced removal, dispossession on Cherokee people with regard to our relationships to the land and the plants that we know and use as medicine, food, crafts, etc. And so I talk about Wildcat's 4 removals, and the first one, as I just described, has to do with relocation, forced relocation. And this occurred for Cherokee people in the late 1830s, so 1838, 1839. And here we have pictured the Blue Ridge Mountains that I showed on the map previously. And I want to give a little bit more context, drawing from a friend and scholar at University of Georgia, Alfred Vick, who writes, the Southern Appalachian Mountains are considered one of the most botanically diverse temperate ecoregions in the world. These mountains were formed roughly 425 million years ago and have remained relatively stable over the last 200 million years, allowing for the evolution of tremendous biodiversity, including over 130 species of trees, 1,500 species of flowering plants, and over 4,000 species of other plants. And we compare those images of the Southern Appalachians with this image that I took, this photograph of the Ozark Mountains in the easternmost part of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. And you see there's some similarities in terms of topography, but it's also much less dramatic than that of the homelands. But specifically what I'm referring to in terms of our reservation, our tribal jurisdiction area, which is actually an archaic term, I should just say simply the reservation as of the McGirt ruling last summer. But this topographic cutout here showing the Cherokee Nation reservation, the orange dotted area showing again that westernmost extent of the Ozark Mountains, where a lot of our Cherokee communities reestablished themselves before and after the Trail of Tears. There's a history of our people moving out in advance of the Trail of Tears too, who were there and actually met those who walked the trail in 1838, 1839 after they arrived. But I want to continue with Alfred Vick's words here because it shows what we lost as a result of this forced displacement. He writes, of the 739 plants that are documented to have been used by the Cherokee Indians prior to removal, 230 of them are not native to Oklahoma. That is 31.1% of the plant species that were utilized for medicine, food, fiber, dye, and other uses were not found growing naturally in the new landscape that awaited Cherokees at the terminus of the Trail of Tears. And so, speaking of Daniel Wildcat's 4 removals, the second removal that he describes has to do with allotment, and simply put, the theft of tribal lands after the forced relocation of many of the southeastern tribes, and other tribes experienced their own relocations throughout the country. But here in the context of the Cherokee Nation, this policy Cherokee leaders were able to stave it off until quite later than other nations. But nonetheless, we were dealt a severe blow in terms of our jurisdiction, our tribal land base. Here we see, again, that familiar looking polygon that represents the Cherokee Reservation. But within that, these dark areas represent the remaining tribal lands that we actually have control over as trust lands. So we went from the full polygon here representing 4.42 million acres to roughly about 100,000 acres of land as a result of the allotment policy. And that was about 98% land loss. When we think about a policy that went in many ways hand in hand with allotment, the assimilation policy is the third removal that Wildcat describes. And here I'm talking about, of course, the boarding school system. We can talk about Oklahoma statehood that happened during the assimilation policy that also dealt a severe blow to tribal sovereignty throughout the state, but especially among the 5 tribes, and Cherokees included, of course. And then we can also point to the criminalization of indigenous religions during this time, as well as something that coincided with assimilation. And again, this kind of more, I guess you could say, metaphorical removal that Wildcat is referring to. And the fourth removal, before I get to that, let me go back here. The fourth removal that Wildcat describes has to do with climate change. And so if we think back to that map that I showed of the contrasting the geographical difference between the homelands and where we are presently, the Cherokee Nation, we look at that and think about the fact that the climate is shifting. We're witnessing increases in annual temperature, and it's really threatening the ability of Cherokee people to access plants that grow within that very limited area, we should say, of the Western Ozarks, where our people found a lot of similar plants. Even though, as I brought up in the quote by Alfred Vick, there was a lot of loss, we still recognized a lot of them in that oak hickory woodland area. And so we see that being encroached upon by, again, as I said, higher annual temperatures, decrease in precipitation, overall threatening those plants and our access to them on the limited amount of tribal lands that we have left. And I often quote my friend, and I just often describe him as my co-conspirator back in Oklahoma, Pat Gwynn, who said, you know, at this time we're being removed, but Cherokee people are staying put. And so the climate is being shifted around us. And that is just a profound thought in my mind with regard to the threats that climate change poses to us as a people. And so when I think about adaptation, I think about that despite all of this loss, Cherokee people didn't stop using and caring for plants. Our relationality to the land persisted through a process that I like to call relational continuity. What I mean by that term is the process of maintaining dynamic relationships with the land and more than human beings that are predicated on ethics of care and kinship despite forced displacement and migrations. This is expressed in our language as Nigada, Gust, Didadata, Ne. We are all related. And I just want to acknowledge my elder, John Ross, teaching me that phrase in the language, how to express that in our Cherokee language. So this persistence of ethically and culturally grounded relationships with the land and non-humans is the foundation for Cherokee environmental innovation and adaptation through time. We see this historically in the way Cherokees adapted to a new homeland in the West by transporting seeds of food and medicine plants, practicing cultural burning, and learning about this new place through observation, passing knowledge down generationally and through our relationship to the Creator. And we are still innovating and adapting today. And so just to go through some of what Cherokee people are doing presently, and really as a segue into my work through the current land education program, we're revitalizing traditional knowledge, and I'll talk more about that later. But we're also planning responses to decreased access to cultural use plants on our existing tribal lands through many different ways. One is securing gathering rights to the east. The Cherokee Nation, I was involved in a project working with the medicine keepers, who I work with very closely, on a gathering agreement for between the Cherokee Nation and Buffalo National River in north central Arkansas. So thinking ahead about accessing our medicinal plants, our other plants that we use for various reasons, in areas that are not only protected, ironically, through the national park system that historically displaced Indigenous peoples from lands, but nonetheless serve as a way to procure and maintain these harvesting rights further to the east in areas that are a bit more protected and that might have that actually have a lot more biodiversity. Also establishing tribal conservation areas, and potentially in the future, we're looking at greenhouses to grow out some of our plants that are really hard to find, maybe grow in sensitive environments. We're working, and I'll show a picture a little bit later, on establishing conservation areas for cultural purposes, for use by those who wish to perpetuate Cherokee knowledge and practices that are land-based. And then also something kind of more aspirational, thinking about diversifying our food system and medicines through knowledge exchanges with other Indigenous nations. And so if we're experiencing these risks, these threats to lands that we currently reside in that are nonetheless fixed, and we see the climate shifting, how can we work with our relatives in other Indigenous nations to learn about plants that may grow in areas further out west and more arid regions, to think about how to continue to maintain land-based ways of life in the face of inevitable climate shift. And so I mentioned the work that I've been doing on a land education program. This is really inextricable from my relationship to a small group of elders and knowledge keepers who call themselves the Cherokee Nation Medicine Keepers. I've been working with them since their formation in 2008. They're a small group of fluent-speaking Cherokee elders who function as an advisory council to the Secretary of Natural Resources in the Cherokee Nation, specifically on ethnobiological issues. And their broad mission is to perpetuate Cherokee knowledge of wild plants and to preserve the health of Cherokee lands for the benefit of present and future generations. And this is an image of some of the members of the group, along with some of our tribal leaders. They're receiving an award for their community efforts in community leadership at our Cherokee National Holiday back in 2017. Again, this was just those who could attend the banquet, but it was quite a significant recognition for their work and what they've been doing over the past decade and more. This is my book that I wrote that really kind of puts the work that they're doing and the work that we're doing together in political and historical context. Really asking, how do we get to this point, and what is the significance of the work of the medicine keepers to influence the way that the Cherokee Nation makes decisions and carries out policies and practices with regard to environmental governance, natural resource management today. And all of the profits, or the very minimal profits or proceeds that I see from that go back to the medicine keepers, just FYI. And so finally going into my current research and really trying to tie all this together, looking at the history, the kind of more theoretical context, and what we're doing about it in Oklahoma. Privileged to be funded by the National Science Foundation through an Early Career Faculty Award. It's a 5-year project started in 2017. Of course, the pandemic has impacted the work we've been able to do, but we hope to get back up and running as soon as possible when it's safe, of course. It's an integrated community-based research and education project. And our methods include designing a land education curriculum, implementing that through a land education program that I'll talk more about here in a minute, but also, as I mentioned, through the community-based research component. I'm an environmental social scientist by training, and so we work ethnographically to conduct research with 3 different communities, and the methods that we use are surveys, in-depth ethnographic interviews, and looking forward to the future participatory mapping project that really the end goal is to identify the issues that Cherokee people are having with regard to accessing plants for medicine or for other uses, and really kind of lend the Cherokee Nation's resources to conserving lands or setting aside lands, buying back lands, whatever it takes to alleviate those impediments to accessing them. And so really thinking about that, but also how this impeded access influences Cherokee people and their overall health. And then perhaps most importantly, how Cherokee responses might inform such comprehensive strategies for climate change, adaptation, conservation, and cultural revitalization. And so thinking about the land education component of this project, thinking about a curriculum for a Cherokee land education project was something that we spent a year on. We spent we had workshops discussing from the perspective of the medicine keepers here. I'm pictured with Phyllis Edwards in the center, and Bonnie Kirk Jigesa on the right, a dear friend and elder who passed away last year. We miss her very much. But this is an image of us during the curriculum building and development project. Notice we're outside, we're seated around a fire, we're talking about what it would look like to design a Cherokee land education program that pushed back against the assimilation policy, that pushed back against the experiences that our elders today are survivors of when it comes to the boarding school system. And so just to kind of speed through, I think I'm running short on time here, but what we're doing through the Cherokee Environmental Leadership Program is approaching these issues from many different angles, if you will. And so this is a land-based education project centering Cherokee knowledge and language, but also addressing Western science, so attempting to kind of incorporate Western approaches through the work that we do with our Secretary of Natural Resources Office and the tribal biologists who are a central part of that. So the students get to learn about a Western understanding and more biologically based science from that perspective, as well as our Cherokee-centered and language-centered approach to learning about the land. This also includes relevant policy and management issues that pertain to our land and territory. As I mentioned, the community-based research project that the cohort and I are working on together. The cohort of 5 students are research assistants, and so we work together to carry out the community-based project. And ultimately, the big goal is that we're building a cohort of tribal environmental leaders who can take on the issues we face using all of these approaches. And so what we do, we have 3 group meetings per year that are centered on land and food-based activities. The students have elder mentor projects that they're working on as an ongoing part of the 3-year project or the 3-year program. We have online meetings where we discuss the language, we study the language, we discuss selected readings, we talk about any updates they have from their elder mentor projects and just generally connect together since I'm here in Colorado. They have outings with tribal cultural biologists throughout the year when it's safe and when the weather is permitting. And the students work in the heirloom crop and medicine gardens during the growing season, which is really an internationally renowned program that the Cherokee Nation maintains in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And then lastly, in tandem or in cooperation with the Natural Resources Office, they caretake and maintain the Tribal Conservation Tract, where we conduct a lot of our land-based activities. And so in closing, I just want to go through a few images here and then turn it over to my co-panelists. This is the group up in the top left meeting at our elder Crosland Smith's house. He's a spiritual leader for the Cherokee Nation, practicing healer, and 91 years old as of last November. He started the project off with the traditional blessing, just to make sure that we did things from the beginning in a good way, in a spiritual way. The bottom left shows our students following Pat Gwynn, our tribal biologist, on an ethnobotanical walk. And this is on the tract of land that's set aside as a conservation tract for cultural use. And then the bottom right is the students getting a tour of our Cherokee heirloom crop garden by Feather Smith, and learning about how they grow out these heirloom seeds every year and distribute them to Cherokee citizens. So I think I only have time to really be brief here, but this was our initial activity that centered around this most sacred food, using corn that was grown out by the heirloom crop program. The students learned how to shell it, grind it down, and then make it into cornbread from scratch. We often have impromptu lessons. At the bottom left, you see Crosland Smith giving the students a lesson on sacred Cherokee symbology. All of our meetings entail in some form or another cooking food and sharing food together. And so these are just some images of the elders serving food, specifically the cornbread that the students worked hard to make. This is just an image of another image of our tract of tribal land that we use to conduct these activities. And the elders have given it a name that means a peaceful place of medicine, Nawatohi Yada Nawoti'i. And in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there, but I could talk a lot more about our activities, what we do out on the land. This is a great image of a project that we worked on involving a traditional craftsman, David Cummingdeer, making for us these giant mortar and pestles to make a traditional food. And so with that, I know I'm over time. Sorry about that, Jess, but I'm going to go ahead and stop and then turn it over to my co-panelists. So thank you all very much, Wadon, and look forward to the Q&A.
All right, thanks so much, Dr. Carroll. So next we welcome Heather Kendall-Miller, coming to us from not one, but two devices. I think it's gonna work. So Heather is Denaina Athabaskan and a tribal member of the Cherokee tribe of Dillingham, Alaska. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Alaska Fairbanks in 1988 and her JD from Harvard Law School in 1991. After clerking with Chief Justice Rabinowitz of the Alaska Supreme Court, Heather received a 2-year Skadden Fellowship to work for the Alaska Legal Services and the Native American Rights Fund in the area of Alaskan Native rights. Heather became staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund in 1993, and her litigations experience is very broad, having argued before the United States Supreme Court, the DC Court of Appeals, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals en banc. Welcome, Heather.
Hi, Jess. Can you hear me? Testing all of my
yeah, sounds good.
All right, very good. Thank you. Thank you so much. It is an honor to be invited to speak, and on this panel in particular. It warms my heart to think that law students are paying attention to these kinds of conversations, and to follow Germaine and Clint's presentation is, again, wonderful and warms my heart. Thank you. Thank you for your contributions. I loved what you had to say, Clint, about the 4 removals. And I think that segues nicely into what I want to contribute today in terms of what's happening on climate change impacts in Alaska. And beyond that, what I think we can look forward to. And like what has been expressed by others today, it's a new day. We wake up and there's reason to be optimistic, even in the face of so many really very, very real challenges. So let me just say I'm here speaking to you from Anchorage, Alaska. I'm on Dena'ina lands. I am a Dena'ina tribal member, and I have spent the better part of my professional career working in the law, representing Alaska Native tribes, protecting, for the most part, their rights to hunt and fish and continue in what we call subsistence way of life. And when I say subsistence way of life, I do not mean to use that term to imply what non-natives view subsistence as being a marginal way of life. To the contrary, for us as Alaska Native people, the subsistence way of life represents a much bigger approach to engaging and understanding, as has been said by Germaine and Clint, relationships, the relationships to the broader landscapes, to the broader world, our relationships not just with each other, but all of its life forms. So when I first came as an attorney and started practicing law, for those of you who are in law school, you may have taken courses in federal Indian law or in environmental law. And what you are learning is that for the most part, our Western legal system is just that. It's a Western legal system. And it has developed over time based upon the colonialist mindset. You've heard today about where science and traditional knowledge systems are meeting and contributing to our understanding of the natural world. We haven't seen that happen in the area of law quite as quickly, but I am hopeful that that will follow. When I started working in the law years ago, I used what was then considered, the equivalent of a treaty right, where we would go into court and we would use a federal statute to basically establish a right. We would sue the state of Alaska or the federal government, and these statutes that were passed to protect rights usually were the result of the fact that tribes had to give something up. We know in the lower 48, that happened with treaties. And tribes were forced onto reservations, and then they had reserved rights that were left to them through treaties. And so if somebody was not able to hunt or fish in their usual custom place, you can use a treaty right to go into court and establish that right. Here in Alaska, we had substitute legislation that was passed as recently as 1980. And that substitute legislation came in the form of a title in what was a bigger piece of legislation, the Alaska National Conservation Lands Interest Act. That's a mouthful. But that legislation was passed in 1980 to set aside federal lands in Alaska and designate those lands for particular purposes, whether they would be refuges, parks, preserves, whatever. In that legislation, Congress also included Title VIII, which was intended to prioritize subsistence uses and taking of subsistence uses as the highest priority when there was not enough resource for everybody. And that became the legal tool by which I was able to litigate on behalf of Native American rights for many years. And as Jess has said, I got to represent great leaders like Katie John and such, protecting subsistence rights. But what I found over time is that the legal mechanisms that we had were not sufficient to really protect the rights that were being lost, in large part, to climate change impacts. I spent years going to meetings, talking to clients, and listening to their concerns. But towards the later part of the 90s, my clients were not just talking about being prevented from being able to exercise subsistence rights. They were talking a lot about impacts that they were seeing in and around them. Things like thinning ice, the movements of animals in ways that they hadn't seen before, species showing up in places where they did not belong. And these kinds of concerns were becoming louder and louder and louder. And so I, of course, had to pay attention to them. And it was about this time that the General Accounting Office also came out with a report that showed that a large number of our native villages that were located on the coastline or on rivers were eroding into the Chukchi Sea or into the river systems. And the General Accounting Office did a study that came out in 2009 that showed that as many as 12 of these villages would have to be relocated because they were an imminent threat or in danger of falling into the ocean. Now, the cost of moving infrastructure that goes into any one village is in the millions. We're talking about $300 or $400 million. These communities are typically communities that were forced to have to reside in one place when the government required Native people to put their children in school, or if they would not agree to live in a community in the wintertime, their children would be taken away and put into boarding school. That was the impetus for most of the villages that wound up becoming sedentary year-round villages. And people did that as a way of being able to keep their families together and not have to have their children go off to boarding school. I'm going to use the example of Kivalina, the village of Kivalina, because that was a community that was specifically designated by the General Accounting Office as being one of many that was going to have to relocate within a period of years. I had a very good friend of mine from law school who had been working closely with the native village of Kivalina on a different case that he had brought on their behalf to prevent toxins from a mine that was going into their drinking water. And he had developed very good relations with that community. So they knew of my work as an ARF attorney in representing the interests of Native people in subsistence rights. So I was invited to go up to Kivalina with my friend and discuss with them the possibility of joining a new lawsuit that would be brought on their behalf to test the law in whether or not it could sustain a climate change action. I went up to Kivalina and I still to this day am moved by the memory of talking to an elder up there. And the elder was a woman named Lucy Ewan, and she told me this incredible story. She was already in her late 70s at the time, and she described to me her parents, and her parents were Inupiat Eskimos that lived a traditional subsistence lifestyle on the North Slope, one of the most extreme ecosystems that exist. And yet there, Inuit people have been able to maintain their lifeways for millennia based upon their knowledge of the natural world. And her father had brought 12 children into the world. And I asked her, well, what does that mean? Did your parents go and go to a village where she could get the benefit of a midwife or something? And she said, no, my father brought each and every one of my siblings into the world. And then he was such a capable hunter that he was able to get enough hunting and fishing to supply all 12 family members plus 2 dogs sleds, enough dogs to pull 2 dog sleds. And when I thought about that, that just like boggled my mind, how proficient a hunter could be to do that in an environment that is so extreme. And when they were told that they had to bring in their children to live in one place or to give them up for boarding school, they decided that they would bring their children in. And his knowledge of the landscape was so broad that he built boats and brought his entire family and his dogs by boats down around the Chukchi Sea to the area where Kivalina was eventually situated. And the federal government did not provide the people who were coming into that community with any kind of help or houses. They just supplied a school. And so these people that came into that area, they had to build huts to live in. And Lucy's son was at least 10 years younger than I am. So he's got to be 55 now. And he lived in a sod hut until he was 10 years old. Again, I give you these examples of people who are just amazingly resilient, who are living in Kivalina, not because that's where they chose to be, but because the federal government told them, you have to live here to have your kids go to school, or else we're going to take your children away from you. And then, of course, once they moved there, then the government brought in infrastructure, and Kivalina became what it is today, a village community. But unfortunately, because there's, with increasing climate change, there is no fast ice that is holding, that is protecting the spit of Kivalina from winter storms, and it is eroding into the ocean very, very quickly. So that was my introduction to Kivalina, and then to see that in one lifetime, people like Lucy was going to go from a childhood of growing up living off the land to living in a community in which the entire community was going to have to be relocated yet again due to climate change, was quite the span. And so that forced us to think about, could the law be used as a means to bring a litigation that would assist this community, at least in getting the funds to be able to help with relocation. So a litigation was designed, and I worked with a team of other attorneys that had much more experience in complex litigation. And we brought litigation against 23 of the biggest emitters of carbon emissions. They consisted primarily of oil companies, electric companies, and coal companies. And the litigation was brought in California District Court, and we knew it would be an uphill lift. But we had also brought in attorneys that had vast experience working on the tobacco litigation. And that tobacco litigation was thrown out many times before the attorneys found a successful way of maintaining jurisdiction and proceeding on those claims, which eventually wound up leading to huge settlements that helped the states throughout the South be able to mitigate against all the harms that people had suffered as a result of smoking cigarettes. So the litigation that was brought on behalf of Kivalina was purposely designed to try to get damages that would assist the community with their climate change evacuations. And the damages that were identified were essentially those that the Government Accountability Office had identified as being necessary to relocate that community, somewhere in the park of between $300 and $400 million. Ultimately, that litigation did not succeed. The district court judge in California ruled that the political doctrine prevented Kivalina from being able to bring their claims in court. She decided that courts were not prepared to be able to deal with such claims. And the case was dismissed, and the Ninth Circuit upheld that dismissal when it went up on appeal. So although my colleagues believed that it was still possible to bring similar such claims in state courts, we realized at the time that the law had not developed far enough to be able to successfully litigate these kinds of claims, and decided rather than to pursue additional litigation, what we needed to do was wait for the law to catch up. So I want to say that I believe that we are in that process of waiting for the law to catch up. And in some respects, I think that we can look positively on some of the developments that are taking place today. And what I want to point to is some of the things that are taking place that are a direct result of the Indigenous worldview that has been recognized in other countries, and in part that has been taking place in the realm of the rights of nature. I think you at the University of Oregon have a professor there that has been teaching in this area, or at least has been making statements on some of the developments that we have been seeing in the rights of nature. And when I say the rights of nature, Craig Kaufman is the professor of poli-sci at the University of Oregon. And for those you students that may be interested, law students that may be interested in looking at this area, I find it very fascinating because it is a direct response to the concern of Indigenous peoples around the world that have been bringing their concerns to the United Nations and other forums to say that there is no current protections for the values that we place on our relations. You heard both Clint and Germaine talking about how Indigenous worldview, we are in relationship with the natural world. And that relationship requires that there be reciprocity. And that reciprocity can come in a form as simple as thanking plants for giving themselves their nutrients to us, or it can be in the form of bringing a lawsuit to clean up a river. Or what we're seeing more and more, and which is exciting, is that tribes and Indigenous people around the world are adopting laws, either through tribal ordinances or in constitutions. They're adopting laws that are recognizing that nature itself has a personhood and should be recognized in the law. And so I'd say that the proponents of the rights of nature argue that laws are grounded in nature's rights better direct humanity to act in ways consistent with modern system-based science, which demonstrates that humans and the natural world are fundamentally interconnected. And proponents of the rights of nature also contend that from the abolition of slavery to the granting to women of the right to vote, to civil rights movement and recognition of other fundamental rights, societies have continued to expand rights in parallel with a growing acceptance of the inherent moral worth of the potential new rights holders. And that this expansion of the circle of community ought to continue to grow to encompass the natural world. So rather than treating nature as property, rights of nature acknowledges that nature in all its life forms has the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles. And it might sound strange for us to think about having a legal entity like a river, but we do this all the time with corporations. Think about Citizens United. Think about corporations are now recognized as persons in the common law. And there's all sorts of protections that these persons as corporations have. So what we're seeing is an expansion of personhood in a way that is encompassing the rights of nature. And this raises all kinds of questions in the area of the law as to whether or not these kinds of rights are going to be able to be enforceable. I think what we're seeing in this past couple of days, to me, suggests that there's going to be a real possibility that we're going to be able to see developments in the law in ways that bring about a recognition of the rights of nature. And what I'm talking about in particular right now is the Biden administration's commitment to bring back science into the administration, and not only bring back science, but rely heavily on Indigenous peoples and in traditional knowledge to inform science for purposes of making policy. And that is what is absolutely critical right now in terms of addressing climate change. Yesterday, or 2 days ago, when Biden took office, was sworn in, he issued a series of executive orders. And one of the most important ones that immediately got my attention was the executive order protecting public health and the environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis. Now, I thought I was going to be able to share that. Maybe I can share that. I did have it on my screen, but maybe I won't be able to share it. Anyways, let me just tell you that the executive order, you guys all have computers, you can pull it up. It's called Protecting Public Health and the Environment and Restoring Science to Tackle Climate Crisis. This order is important for many reasons. I want to touch upon just a couple. First of all, it requires the Department of Interior to conduct a review of the monument boundaries and conditions of the Grand Staircase Escalante, Bears Ears, Northeast Canyons, and Seamounts National Monuments, and directs Interior in consultation with other agencies and tribal governments to determine whether restoration of the monuments would be appropriate. Now, I think you can agree that if we have the confirmation of the Secretary of Interior in the person of Deb Haaland, we're going to have a very strong advocate for arguing that, yes, certainly it's time to reestablish those boundaries. I think those monuments are some of the most important religious sacred sites to tribes throughout the Southwest. So that's positive. The same executive order also places a temporary moratorium on the activities related to implementation of the Coastal Plain Oil and Gas Leasing Program of the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge and Policy Review. There too, the Gwich'in people of the Arctic have long said that the calving grounds are sacred, that the calving grounds are related to the Caribou. They are the Caribou people, and those lands are sacred and should not be open to oil and gas. And especially at a time when we are trying to combat climate change, opening up those lands to additional leasing is the wrong direction to go. And then on the executive order, in addition to those two things, the executive order has in section 5 something that I found pretty fascinating. And because it's accounting for the benefits of reducing climate pollution, the order directs the agencies to capture the full cost of greenhouse emissions, including the value of ecosystems. Now, from my perspective, this is a really big deal, because what I learned from the Kendall-Miller litigation is that the law does not capture values. It captures damages to some extent, but it doesn't yet capture values. And what we need is for an expansion in the law to recognize that when we're talking about values that we are going to protect, we're talking about ecosystem values, and those values are much broader. They are relational, they are connected. And so I think that it gives me hope to see that this administration is looking at what are ecosystem services if they are going to place values on those. And these services are typically categorized under 4 types: provisioning, regulatory, supporting, and cultural services. Cultural services includes intangible benefits obtained from contact with nature. So this is extraordinary to me that we are finally able to see that we are going to have people within the Interior Department and the Solicitor's Office that are not only going to be prioritizing how to combat climate change, but they are going to be doing so from a vantage point of recognizing the Indigenous worldview, that everything is connected and everything is related, because that brings in a much broader holistic tend. Excuse me. I'm looking at the questions here. Would Section 5 lend to carbon tax prevent costs of exterminatus cleanliness? When I don't know that yet. I think that what they are trying to do at this stage is to get a better understanding of what values are encompassed when you're looking at ecosystems, and be able to put a monetary value on greater aspects, and do so in a way that will bring greater accountability to considerations whenever there is going to be a project that may potentially impact or have climate change impacts. I learned yesterday that there will be, in addition to Deb Haaland, the first Native American to ever be confirmed as the Secretary of Department of the Interior. Interior itself is going to have 3 Native Americans in the Solicitor's Office and another 2 in the Secretary's Office. Each of these individuals will bring to that position a grounding and an understanding that comes from this Indigenous worldview that we are in connection and relationship with the natural world. That is going to be critical in terms of bringing a whole shift in understanding of climate change responses and such. And I cannot wait to see this body of bright new attorneys go into this field and help forge a new way of understanding what are our responsibilities to the natural world, and how can we shift the law in ways that allow us to give voice to the rights of nature. And I think I will stop there and let Ruth take on, and then we can get to the question and answers.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Heather. Brief introduction here for Ruth. So Ruth is a Dena'ina Athabascan and Ashkenazi Russian Jewish woman raised in Anchorage, Alaska. She is a member of the Cherokee tribe from the Lake Clark region. She also has roots in Bristol Bay. She is currently the climate justice organizer for Native Movement, which is a matriarchal grassroots Indigenous organization that fights for the rights of Indigenous peoples, their lands and waters, and justice for their ancestors and descendants. She has a long resume. She is also a daughter, granddaughter, auntie, language learner, traditional bead worker, and a fisherwoman. So welcome, Ruth. I know you have a lot to say.
Chikanik just to be specific, I'm the daughter of Heather, who just spoke, and honored to be so. Before I speak and introduce myself, first I'd like to share some words from a very cherished elder from Utqiagvik. And so if I can here, I'll share my screen.
Wangan nudak Utqiagvik meo. Angop kanak goyak suli Simmons goyak. My name is Doreen Simmons. I'm from the Angopkana and the Simmons family. And my favorite ice cream is Akutok Eskimo ice cream. 100 years ago, our people were completely nomadic community. All the families were nomadic. We followed the birds, the fish, the whales. When they were in season, we were there. And so they were like our leaders. They were our bosses. And we had to keep the land clean for them. We could not have a messy, a trashy, dirty place for them to come to, or they wouldn't want to come at all. And we love to eat what they gave us. We had much gratitude for them when they came. And we need to keep that up. This is our land. And this is what we call Taryok, where we get our whale and our fish.
Aviga, thank you to Nutak. And Yachlidu, everyone. Shvaik Isench u Ruth Miller Shiji. Denny Inakanaga Shalkun Kanasht u Choriangash Nanish Ite. Shibiznak Heather Kendall-Miller Shumktach u Lloyd Miller Stukta. Chiknekali Kidiki, Eko Kashin Chubishkai Kilandach u Degekak Shuguya Studa. Yetel Henu Bagut Yachli etc. Hello, everyone. My English name is Ruth Miller. My Dena'ina name is Shvaik Isen, which was given to me by Danita Slauson, my first language teacher. I'm the daughter of Heather Kendall-Miller and Lloyd Miller, and a Dena'ina woman of the Chiriang tribe of Dena'ina Athabaskan. And I work presently as the climate justice organizer for Native Movement, a matriarchal Indigenous nonprofit based here in Degayakak, Anchorage, Alaska, that works through a multiplicity of ways to advocate for not just our Indigenous ways of life, but for our Indigenous sovereignty, for our cultural presence here in Alaska, and for the continuation in perpetuity of our ways of being. And so I know that I offer a bit of a different perspective, not only being a youth, and humbled and wildly unprepared and undeserving to be here speaking amongst these other panelists, but also because we don't have much representation yet from an advocacy, a kind of radical advocacy perspective, although I know our other panelists have plenty of experience with that. So I wanted to speak a bit about what climate advocacy on the ground looks like and what dialectical interventions we're making through protest and through movement building amongst our own communities. So I often begin talking about my story into climate advocacy with my very first job out in Bristol Bay in Dillingham, where I worked for United Tribes of Bristol Bay, helping fishermen and community members prepare testimony in opposition to the then proposed Pebble Mine, which is still a frustrating conflict today, although looking much brighter with the support of the Biden administration. Out in the Bay, I intended to help write testimony, share postcards. I sat in a condemned storage, like a shipping container in the harbor with a bear taser to defend myself, to help people learn how to tell their stories, to help validate people's stories of our changing climate and what the mine would bring to the Bristol Bay watershed. But on my first day of work. I never went into the office. I didn't even go into the shipping container. I skipped work entirely because the salmon had hit the fish net, the subsistence net of the family I was staying with, work. So I called up my boss, Alana, and work hard. And so that day, my first day of protecting Bristol Bay, I spent cutting salmon. I spent processing the fish with this dear family. We brined it, we hung it, we smoked it, eventually we canned it. And ever since then, I've known that was really my first experience of advocating, of standing up for what climate justice means to me, because it was not just within the context of working against this destructive mine that would jeopardize the last great salmon fishery in the world, but it was an act of loving and caretaking and thanking and expressing gratitude for the salmon that we were fighting so hard to save. And so since then, I went through undergrad at Brown University and have found myself in a lot of international advocacy spaces, national advocacy spaces, predominantly within the United Nations and the Conference of Parties, traveling with Indigenous delegations of youth to advocate for our communities to be explicitly defended in ongoing climate negotiations. This included attendance at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2019 and the Conference of Parties at COP25, the last session in Madrid, Spain. Through this lens of organizing amongst Indigenous community members in these highly colonial and exclusive spaces, we have been able to carve pathways for our community members, those who are not able to travel to New York or Spain, to make their voices heard. Now, the story from Nutak that you heard was one such video. I texted her and asked her, can you tell me why saving the world, why climate justice means so much to you? And this is what she responded with. She responded with one of her traditional stories. And now I've had the honor of sitting with Nutak for hours and hours, and she'll tell you of growing up in sod huts. She'll tell you of speaking, her Nupiaq language. She'll tell you stories of her great-grandparents that she grew up with. And those are the stories that we want to validate and empower and raise up as climate advocacy within decision-making spheres where our people are generally excluded from. This work has also incorporated national decision-making spaces, and I have had the honor through my work with Native Movement to work very closely on the Green New Deal policy writing, particularly the Thrive Agenda, which I would say is a more aggressive and care economy centric version of the policies proposed in the Green New Deal. And now what our advocacy specifically focuses on is not just incorporating thoughtfulness to the specific needs and positionality of Indigenous communities, but incorporating leadership every step of the way. And so we are so pleased, of course, to know that this will be a bit easier with the appointment of a number of really brave and courageous Indigenous community members to some really important positions within the Department of Interior and beyond. And so these national decision-making spaces has been another avenue of advocacy forward. Now, particularly, we work with our elders and our youth. And I would say that that's where a majority of my heart and soul is in building local climate literacy. We do this through a number of ways, particularly through trainings on decolonization. I think that as a privileged and well-positioned person, we also have a responsibility to bringing well-intentioned, conservation-minded individuals along towards just transition and towards incorporating Indigenous sovereignty into their conservation efforts. And so to that aim, we have developed a number of decolonization trainings that we offer to environmental nonprofits, that we offer to schools, that we've offered actually to police departments recently, to help us all share a vocabulary and a conceptual understanding of the legacy and the ongoing destruction that colonization has brought to all of us. And so through that, really at the core of that, we're not only breaking apart the barriers to presenting our lived experience and validating it as science, as real story, but we're also hoping to work with our community to help folks feel empowered to raise up their frontline solutions to climate as well. And so to that extent, we work a lot towards climate storytelling. I'm really excited to produce a media project called Always Indigenous Media, which specifically aims to do that. We say it's media from the people, for the people, and we are social media based so that folks from all over the state, particularly in smaller communities, can not just share their stories of how they're experiencing climate change, what subsistence practices have changed, and share them on a wider platform, but so that the communication can flow both ways, and that when those of us with this access to advocate are attending international, national, and Arctic-oriented events, we're able to give decentralized, accessible updates so that it's our community who can then dictate what we should be doing there. And so through Always Indigenous Media, we've been able to really increase the pathways to advocacy for other community members to see themselves as climate advocates. But I admit I'm racing through this piece a little bit now, although I could and would love to continue expanding on what climate advocacy looks like on the ground. I really want to dive into why it matters. I often feel that as a young person who identifies as a water and land protector, oftentimes movement builders and those who work in social justice spheres specifically tend to get derogated to radicals or protesters or the like, when really there's a much more advanced and complicated dialectical intervention that's taking place, because we are challenging what counts in the public imaginary as a climate story or even as climate science. And so what I'm particularly excited to dive into with this panel here today is why what we're doing matters. There's rigorous dialectical work being done by these movements and these panels that's so much more than just meetings or protests or lawsuits alone. But there is an intervention in the way that we think about science when we begin to explore the way that against Western science. So I feel what we're discussing today is really the politics of recognition. It's an investigation of colonial classification that's imposed a hierarchy on knowledge and has taught all of us that Indigenous knowledge is not science, or that it's not as valid as Western colonial settler science. And so oftentimes, the first point that I'd like to touch on is how oftentimes our Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing are they're labeled as resilient, as shows of resilience, because they are responding to attempted oppression or potentially successful oppression. But I'm interested in diving into even what resiliency means and what happens when we call ourselves and when we identify ourselves as resilient, which is a responsive positionality. Would we have to be resilient if settler colonization had never happened, for example? And so this was reminding me of a conversation that we shared with a really precious elder, a Gwich'in elder named Luke Titus. When we were discussing what is resiliency, he taught us that it is something good on the inside coming out. And so now this is the concept of resiliency that I identify with, because it's not just a reaction to persecution or conflict, but it is something good on the inside that is coming out. And I think that is the sentiment that I really want to bring to expand to the idea of elevating Indigenous ways of knowing. I was often yelled at by an anthropology teacher in undergrad that nothing means on its own. And it's very true, because here there's a long genealogy of the complicated ways settler colonization has relegated Native Americans, our people into erasure, including our subjects of knowledge, removing us from our lands, but also removing our knowledge itself, either by destroying the things we know about, as Clint was bringing up, physically beating and killing the knowledge holders through genocide and assimilation, or by undermining our knowledges and calling it myth or legend or folklore, telling us that our Indigenous knowledges can't be science, they can't be rigorous, they can't be evidence-based, when in truth, we have millennia of experimentation, we have millennia of rigorous scientific inquiry that has led to beautiful and illustrative art and stories that communicate so much more than just a single textbook might. And so I wanted to really dive into this idea of interplay, beginning first with grounded normativity, which is a concept by Jean-Sean Coulthard, which some of you might be familiar with, that he coined, I believe, in Red Skin, White Masks, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition. And so in this book, he describes grounded normativity really as what we've been talking about, the modalities of Indigenous land-connected practices and long-standing experiential knowledge that inform and structure our ethical engagements with the world and our relationships with human and non-human others over time. This is especially important to geography and challenging the way that we see even our different Indigenous cultures and the way we relate to our land, rethinking it as a system of reciprocal relations and obligations. And grounded normativity, this concept, is what is at stake in conflicts of land and knowledge dispossession. But I think the purest example of this very academic term is the words from Nutak that you all shared. This approach to land, methodology, and theory building has the potential to crucially reorient, respatialize, and repoliticize dispossession within settler colonialism, as the disruption, dislocation, and elimination of ways of being, systems of governing, and forms of life of Indigenous peoples and nations. And this is really important to understand. It's really, really important to understand what we're talking about when we mean Indigenous knowledge and where it lies in juxtaposition to its oppressor. So how do we bring this Indigenous knowledge, this grounded normativity, this relationship-based worldview into mobilized advocacy? What are we doing when we focus our protest, when we focus our storytelling and our advocacy from this Indigenous framework? Well, it has to begin with decolonization of the mind. So I want to pull as well on the work of Taiake Alfred, a Mohawk scholar who wrote in Peace, Power, Righteousness, and Indigenous Manifesto on self-conscious traditionalism, which they coin as an ethnopolitical practice of Indigenous resurgence. And we're going to unpack this one too. So this self-conscious traditionalism is a reflective program of culturally grounded desubjectification that aims to undercut the interplay between subjectivity and structural domination that helps maintain settler colonial relationships. So this is to say that the way that we pursue elevating this grounded normativity is through this desubjectification of, in this case, us, ourselves, desubjectifying the human, and the elevating of non-human experience is valid science. To resist the structural hierarchy imposed by the limited subjectivity of Western science. And so in much simpler terms, this means that validating the experiences of our plant relatives, validating the experience of our land and waters and airs, whether this be giving them legal status as an entity, or whether this means understanding their extinction as a fourth or fifth or maybe first removal, as both Heather and Clint brought to us, is a structural crack in the colonial structure that has placed Indigenous knowledges in this hierarchy in the first place. By pursuing this desubjectification, and I would include this resubjectification of formerly denigrated objects, like a canoe or a fish, using a canoe or a fish as a proxy for resistance or resilience, there's a fracturing of the colonial methods of control, specifically dialectical control. We have to be able to imagine Indigenous futurities by resisting settler colonial domination of knowledge forms. Alfred urges Native communities to embody this by returning to their traditional political values to educate a new generation of leaders committed to preserving Indigenous nationhood. Because additionally, it's a critique of the intellectual framework that until now has structured not only relationships or relations between Indigenous nations and the state, but also the internal politics of colonized communities, the colonization of the mind. So what happens when we break this? What happens when we say a salmon is more than a fish, a flower is more than a plant? On the basis of collective communication across movement building and advocacy, Jason Jones, a good friend of mine who I work on a shared project around the Salish season, wrote in The Language in Common, a commentary referring specifically to movement building, but I think equally applies to knowledge building, which is what we're discussing now. And this language in common was really discussing the shift from material culture of seeing climate, seeing lands, waters, plants, animals as a part, material culture, towards relationship culture. On symbols, he wrote, and by symbols, I mean seeing a plant versus seeing a teacher. Quote, the language in common is not merely the constellation of symbols, hashtags, and performative tactics mobilized in the context of social movements. It is the mode of communication of a revolutionary collective coming into being. Collective movements are not fixed entities that precede their modes of appearance. They are constituted as they are made visible and audible. So what this is to say is that the repetition of images, rituals, and signs builds and expresses collective power as it inscribes a gap through which non-capitalist modes of belonging appear. So in this process, the language we use to describe knowledges, the way that we describe our ancestral stories, becomes a material force as it voices an alternative imagination of the world. And so when Jason wrote this piece, he was talking about the potential of building new collective vocabulary, right? But what we have, what Indigenous communities have, is a self-assurance of being more than prefigurative because we've done it before. This brought to me a really important message that another elder shared. And with this message, I'll close. When we began bringing together activists and climate actors from across the state under the concepts and relationships of just transition, we decided to name our summit Kotrelne, which in the language of the Benti Knaga, the Lortan and Adne, means remembering forward. So our dialectical intervention is something that is not new, but it's old. And so when we think about resilience, we're not just being resilient to a colonial power, we're not just reinscribing or rediscovering Indigenous knowledges anew because they were oppressed and opposed, but we have millennia of power and knowledge and strength and experience that we are building on and weaving into the now. So this act shows us the discursive landscape that our movement building is actively participating in. We expose the terrain on which our collectivity is built, sustained, and defended. And this terrain is not a space of agreement or consensus. It's a gap, an open space of struggle in which to determine our collective horizon. And this is the space that this panel is intervening in. So very lastly, I'll end with a brief quote from Gloria Anzaldúa, who wrote in her prolific work, one of my favorites, Let Us Be the Healing of the Wound. She wrote, in addition to community building, we can transform our world by imagining it differently, dreaming it passionately via all our senses and willing it into creation, changing the thoughts and ideas, the stories we live by, and their limiting beliefs, including the national narrative of a supreme entitlement, will enable us to extend our hand to others, con el corazón con razón en la mano, with the heart rightly in the hand. Individually and collectively, we can begin to share strategies on peaceful coexistence y desparramar conocimientos, spread knowledges. Each of us can make a difference by bringing psychological understanding and using spiritual approaches in political activism. We can stop the destruction of our moral, compassionate humanity. Empowered, we'll be motivated to organize, achieve justice, and begin to heal the world. Chikanekele, thank you, everyone.
Wow. Yeah, sort of speechless. I just feel so honored and so grateful to have had the opportunity to work with each of you on this panel. And hearing from Ruth just brings me so much hope, so much excitement. All right, so at this point we have 10 minutes left. I did receive a number of questions from you all. Panelists, if you all want to put your videos on, we'll just have a little group meeting here. I'm tempted to just open the floor for these last 10 minutes to anyone who has sort of pressing comments, given just the wealth of, you know, the wealth, the depth, the breadth of information that we just received. I don't think, or we will not have time to go through all of these questions, and I am hesitant to prioritize any over the others. I do have a question here from an audience member that is for all speakers, and I know that I have heard y'all speak on this, and I think you would have a response. So I will actually just start with that, and then I'd love to hear closing comments. We will still try to wrap this thing up in the next few minutes. Unfortunately, I wish we could just do this all night. All right, so the question I received for all speakers was, what are your thoughts on horizontal discourse with fellow Indigenous people around the world, specifically within climate discourse? I know Ruth has thoughts on that. I know all of you do. So whoever wants to take that.
Go for it, Ruth.
Man, I was just trying to sneak a sip of water. Well, I'll speak very briefly because I just talked for a long time. But you know, I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about the approach of pan-indigeneity, right? The idea that we're all Indigenous, we have a single Indigenous worldview, or even something that could be mobilized. And what I've found through my work experience is the richness of diversity of exchange between Indigenous communities. And I'll use one example just briefly. When I was studying in Providence, Rhode Island, the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples, they were able to reconstruct Wampanoag after 200 years of sleeping, using the Bible that was written originally in Wampanoag 200 years previously. But how they did this was using they've created an immersion preschool, and they did this based on a model of Maori language revitalization in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so now, as I think about the rise of language revitalization here in Alaska, this prompted my entire undergrad thesis on thinking about transnational collaboration between Indigenous communities. And I'm really happy to report that mobilization is already happening. And just last February, nearly a year ago, I had the honor of being at the Continental Gathering of Indigenous Women of the Americas in Mexico City, where we spoke specifically not only on the issues of Indigenous women, but how that intersects with climate justice struggles. So there's plenty of room. And I think that is the clearest pathway towards Indigenous futurisms, is by reinscribing not just independent nationhood, but nation-to-nation relations between Indigenous peoples.
Wonderful. So we have about 5 minutes left. I am a little wary of the time here. So I would love to just hear final thoughts from Clint and Germaine, if we do have Heather there still, and then we will close.
Well, I'll try to be brief and then pass it over to Germaine, if that's all right. Just wanted to say, humbled to be presenting with all of you, really powerful presentations and words. And just what I was jotting down as I was listening, there's a lot, and I have to be brief, but thinking about the way that we get these points across, speaking to some of what Ruth was saying, you know, how do we communicate these ideas? A lot of what I was seeing in the Q&A about, like, how do we do it? You know, this is the perennial question. You know, we're confronted with the reality and the perspectives that I think this panel is trying to put forward, that the current mindset is not going to get us out of what it's gotten us into. And so how do we do so? And I think that battling, as Ruth was saying, the kind of the preeminence or the fact that Western science is always put on a pedestal in terms of solving problems, the crises that we have today, as well as technology, Western technology, is start to come up with a vocabulary, again, back to Ruth's, some of her points, for articulating this in terms of cultural technologies. You know, I'm drawing from my colleagues, Melanie Yazzie, Dene scholar, and then Kucho Risling-Baldi, Hoopa scholar in California, who are talking about what does it mean to enact radical relationality with the world and with each other. And they fundamentally say, you know, if Indigenous peoples are good at one thing, we're good at relating, and we're good at establishing relationships and upholding them in ways that honor that treaty, that compact between beings, whether that's humans or non-humans, right? And so that's kind of one thing that that's resounding on my mind, is how do we talk about cultural technologies that can serve to really upset or unsettle the preoccupation with the technological fix, especially in these days right now when we are looking at the pandemic and the emphasis, of course, on vaccines. Highly important, I'm not arguing about that, but what got us here in the first place when we think about extractivism, globalization, and the ways of life that continually create the conditions for novel viruses that are zoonotic in origin. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
I'd like to thank my fellow panelists as well, and say what a privilege it's been to participate in this panel and think about all of the issues that we've discussed tonight. I feel like what we have tried to do is provide some tools for young people, and stand back, stand out of their way, provide some experience, some knowledge that we've inherited from our elders and ancestors, and pass that forward. I feel like this is an incredible time of uncertainty, and I think that that's where hope is born. That's the place where hope is found and where hope is born during these times of uncertainty. So I feel extraordinarily hopeful as I think about what is yet to come. I think that each of us bring a different perspective about our relationship with the natural world and the lessons from our elders and ancestors. Thank each of my fellow panelists, and thank you, Jess, for your patience and your collaboration. So lemlemsh pesia, lemlemsh. Thank you.
All right, we'll close on that note, having not heard from Heather. Thank you all so much. I mean, again, I'm just so honored to have had the opportunity to work with each of you. And I just want to echo Germaine's sentiments. I also feel hopeful. Thank you all for attending, and have a fabulous night.